June 17, 1945. An American POW processing camp somewhere in the green hills of Bavaria. The war in Europe has been over for exactly 5 weeks, but you wouldn't know it from the faces of the women standing in the June heat, wearing faded Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms that hang loose on frames that have forgotten what abundance feels like. They are Helferinnen, female auxiliaries, and they are trying very hard to maintain the composure that their middle-class upbringings taught them, even as uncertainty gnaws at everything they thought they knew about their futures. A young American GI, maybe 22, from somewhere in the South where Coca-Cola isn't just a drink but a cultural institution, approaches the group with something extended in his hand. It's a glass bottle, sweating with condensation in the summer air, filled with a liquid so dark it looks almost black. The thing inside is bubbling, fizzing with a life of its own, and the women stare at it with the kind of bewilderment usually reserved for alien artifacts. "What is this?" one of them asks in careful English. "Coal tar? Some kind of medicine?" The American grins, not understanding yet that he's about to witness something that will make him question everything he thought he knew about victory and defeat. "Ma'am, that's Coca-Cola. Best drink in America." The women exchange glances. Then, nervous laughter ripples through the group. These are not combat soldiers. These are the women who kept the Wehrmacht's communications functioning, who operated telegraphs and switchboards, who filed paperwork and transcribed orders. Over 500,000 women served in such roles by 1945, educated, often from respectable families, many of them former students or young professionals who'd answered the call for auxiliary service. Radio operators who'd once studied literature. Clerks who'd dreamed of university degrees. Telephone technicians who'd grown up learning piano and proper table manners. And now they're staring at a bottle of dark, fizzing liquid that their captor is offering them as if it's a gift. To understand their reaction, you have to understand what 6 years of total war had done to Germany. The rationing began in 1939, the moment the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland. By 1942, real sugar had vanished from civilian life like a ghost, replaced by saccharin tablets that left a metallic aftertaste and a hollow satisfaction. The coffee wasn't coffee, it was roasted acorns and chicory root, a brown liquid that mocked the memory of the real thing. Bread was stretched with sawdust. Butter became a word people used to describe what they used to eat. By 1943, the descent had accelerated. The average German civilian was surviving on somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 calories per day. For context, the American GI standing before them consumed more than 3,000 calories daily without even thinking about it. He had bacon for breakfast. Real bacon. From actual pigs. The concept would have seemed like fantasy to these women. While they'd been forgetting what sweetness tasted like, the United States had been producing 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola for its troops. 5 billion. The company had built 64 bottling plants around the world, following the American military like a commercial shadow. It cost each soldier exactly 5 cents per bottle, and they could have as many as they wanted. General Eisenhower himself had personally requested that Coca-Cola be available to every American soldier in every theater of war. Robert Woodruff, the company's president, had made an almost absurd promise. Every man in uniform would get a Coke for 5 cents, wherever he was and whatever it cost the company. Most Europeans had never seen Coca-Cola. In Germany, wartime propaganda had spent years dismissing American culture as degenerate, artificial, a civilization built on cheapness and superficiality. And now here it was, this dark, mysterious liquid in a glass bottle, fizzing with chemical energy, offered by a well-fed soldier who looked impossibly young and impossibly healthy and impossibly supplied. The gulf between these two worlds, between deprivation and abundance, was about to reveal itself in the most unexpected way. The first woman takes the bottle with hesitant hands. She brings it to her lips. The group watches. The GI watches. History holds its breath. The hiss of carbonation is unfamiliar in a world that has spent 3 years drinking flat, lukewarm substitutes for everything. She tips the bottle back, and her expression begins to shift through a sequence of reactions that seem to surprise even her. Shock at the cold temperature, they haven't had ice in years. Confusion at the bubbles assaulting her tongue. And then bewilderment at the taste. But how sweet! Impossibly sweet. Real sweetness, the kind that comes from actual refined sugar, not from chemicals pretending to be sugar. She lowers the bottle and makes a face. The other women lean forward, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of this strange new thing that has entered their world. Someone says, "Is this what Americans drink instead of beer?" Another voice, "They put medicine in a bottle and call it refreshment?" A third, with a hint of desperate humor, "No wonder they won the war, they were too confused by their own beverages to feel fear." The laughter spreads. Polite, exhausted, tinged with the surreal absurdity of their situation. The American GI looks bemused but pleased. He has a whole crate of the stuff. He thinks he has plenty to share. He has no idea what's about to happen. The second woman takes the bottle. She's more deliberate, studying the dark liquid like it might reveal secrets. She sips, pauses, then sips again. Something flickers across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or memory stirring from a place she thought had died 3 years ago. Her hand tightens around the glass neck of the bottle. This has real sugar," she says quietly, almost to herself. The words hang in the air like a confession. The other women go still. Real sugar. The phrase carries weight that no American standing there could possibly understand. The last time most of these women tasted genuine refined sugar was 1942. 3 years ago. 3 years of saccharin tablets that tasted like tin and regret. 3 years of ersatz everything, of substitutes and approximations and things that were supposed to make you forget what the real thing tasted like. But the body remembers what the mind tries to bury. And now chemistry takes over. Sugar-deprived bodies don't react to sudden sweetness with moderation. They react with urgency. The brain floods with dopamine. Energy surges through systems that have been running on fumes and willpower. The second woman takes another drink, longer this time, and you can almost see the transformation happening in her eyes. "May I try?" Another voice, polite but with an edge that wasn't there before. The American, still operating under the assumption that he's simply sharing an amusing cultural artifact, reaches into his crate. "Sure, here's another bottle." He extends it with the casual generosity of someone who has never known scarcity. Who has, in fact, never even conceptualized what scarcity might feel like. A third bottle. A fourth. The crowd of women grows as word spreads through the camp in that mysterious way information travels in confined spaces. More Helferinnen drift over, women who'd been sitting in the shade trying to stay cool, trying not to think about uncertain futures and families they haven't heard from in cities that might not exist anymore. But now there's something immediate, something present, something that tastes like a world they'd almost forgotten existed. The bottles circulate. Each woman takes her sip, her taste, her moment with this strange American abundance. And with each taste, the laughter dies a little more. The mockery fades. Something else replaces it. Something urgent and primal that these educated, proper, middle-class German women would have been horrified to recognize in themselves just 6 weeks earlier, when there was still a war to believe in. "Is there more?" someone asks. Not polite anymore. Direct. The GI checks his crate. 6 bottles left. He looks up at the crowd and does the math he should have done earlier. 30-some women. 6 bottles. The equation doesn't work. "I can bring more tomorrow," he offers, but his voice has lost its confidence. He's starting to understand that he's stumbled into something he wasn't prepared for. A woman, she'd been a schoolteacher in Munich before the war, taught children grammar and history and the proper way to hold a pencil, reaches for a bottle with both hands. Another woman, a former nurse who'd once prided herself on her professional composure, moves to intercept. Their fingers meet on the glass. "I haven't had one yet," the teacher says in German, her voice rising. "You had a sip from the first bottle," the nurse counters. "That was barely anything." The words come faster now, in German that the American can't follow but whose emotional content needs no translation. Other women press closer. Someone offers a cigarette in trade, precious currency in any camp. Another produces a ration ticket, worthless now but still clutched like it means something. A third removes a small gold ring from her finger, holding it out with trembling hands. For a bottle of Coca-Cola. 4 dark fizzing sugar water that costs 5 American cents. The GI backs up a step, then another. He's seen men fight over poker debts. He's seen soldiers come to blows over insults and accusations and the kinds of things that men with guns and too much time will find to argue about. But these were secretaries. Radio operators. Women who probably knew more languages than he did, who could type faster than he could think, who came from homes with books and pianos and Sunday dinner traditions. And they're fighting over soda. A bottle is grabbed from someone's hand. Nearly drops. The dark liquid sloshes dangerously close to the rim. A cry of protest in German, sharp and desperate. The crowd surges slightly, bodies pressing together in the heat. The thin veneer of dignity that these women have been maintaining for 5 weeks of captivity, the composure that said, "We are still civilized, we are still respectable, we are still the people we were before all of this," cracks like cheap porcelain. A voice rises above the others, almost pleading, "Just one more taste. Please. You don't understand. It's been so long since." She doesn't finish the sentence. She doesn't need to. An American officer appears, drawn by the commotion. He takes one look at the scene, proper German women in faded uniforms, crowding and jostling and arguing over bottles of Coke, and his expression goes through its own sequence of emotions. Confusion. Disbelief. Then something that might be pity, or might be the first real understanding of what "we won the war" actually means. "All right, break it up," he says, not unkindly. "Everyone back. We'll distribute this properly." The women separate slowly, reluctantly. Some are crying now, quiet, ashamed tears that they try to hide. The young GI stands with his crate, no longer smiling, looking at the bottles like they've transformed into something he doesn't recognize. One woman, standing at the edge of the group, speaks softly in English. "I have a university degree. I survived the bombing of Dresden. And I just fought over brown sugar water." She's not talking to anyone in particular. Maybe just to history itself. The officer distributes what remains with the careful precision of someone dividing communion wafers. 1 small cup per woman, measured out from the remaining bottles. No seconds. No exceptions. The women accept their portions in silence now, the fight drained out of them as quickly as it had ignited. They sip slowly this time, making it last, their eyes closed or fixed on the middle distance where memory and present moment blur together. The embarrassment settles over the group like fog. These women will carry this moment with them for decades, not the defeat, not the camps, but this. The day they lost themselves over a soft drink. But they weren't alone in their reaction. The Red Cross reports from 1945 and 1946 are filled with similar incidents, though the bureaucratic language tries to drain the emotion from them. Surprising behavioral responses when POWs encountered Allied rations. That's how the reports phrase it. What they mean is, we watched educated, civilized people weep over white bread. We saw mothers fight over chocolate bars. We documented grown men trembling at the sight of canned peaches. In British camps, German civilians broke down at their first taste of real butter after years of margarine cut with God knows what. In French camps, the administrators noted excessive emotional reactions to fresh fruit. The medical officers who processed these responses weren't documenting moral failure. They were documenting physiology. Refeeding syndrome. The body's chaos when abundance suddenly replaces starvation. The mind's disorientation when deprivation's arithmetic, never enough, always rationed, survival by subtraction, gets replaced by addition's impossible grammar. The Coca-Cola incident revealed something that maps and treaties couldn't show, the true scale of the gap between the defeated and the victorious. Not in tanks or planes or industrial output, those numbers were already known, but in the small, daily experience of being alive. The Germans had spent 6 years learning to survive on less. The Americans had spent 6 years learning to produce more. And in that Bavarian camp in June 1945, Those two educations met in a glass bottle filled with carbonated sugar water. Many American GIs had arrived in Germany expecting to find monsters. The propaganda had prepared them for fanatics, for true believers who'd chosen evil and pursued it with Germanic efficiency. Instead, they found exhausted people who looked more like their own mothers and sisters than like the enemy they'd imagined. The young soldier with his crate of Coca-Cola had learned more in that moment than any interrogation could have taught him. They laughed at our Coke until they tasted it. He'd write home to Georgia or Texas or wherever he came from. Then they fought for it. Made me realize how different our wars were. We were fighting to win. They were just trying not to starve. For the German women, the memory became a marker, a before and after. Before, the world of scarcity they'd known for so long it had become normal. After, the recognition that somewhere else, people had never stopped having enough. Interviews conducted with former POWs decades later, when they were grandmothers living in the prosperous West Germany of the 1960s and 70s, consistently returned to these first encounters with American abundance. Not the battles. Not even liberation. But the taste of real sugar. The sight of white bread. The incomprehensible plenty that American soldiers treated as ordinary. The irony is almost too perfect. Within a decade, Germany would become one of Coca-Cola's largest international markets. The women who laughed at it in 1945 would buy it for their children in 1955. Former Helferinnen would watch their daughters date American soldiers stationed in the new West Germany, bonding over Coke and hamburgers and rock and roll. The drink that had seemed so alien, so incomprehensibly American, would become as German as beer gardens. Though that's not quite right either. It would become something else, a symbol of the new world they'd entered, where abundance wasn't suspicious but expected. But in that moment in June 1945, none of that future was visible. There was only the present, empty Coca-Cola bottles lined up in the sun like soldiers themselves, catching the light and throwing it back in flashes of green glass. German women sitting in whatever shade they could find, some still running their tongues over their teeth to catch the last traces of sweetness. An American GI shaking his head, learning something about war that West Point didn't teach and basic training couldn't prepare him for. He'd brought weapons across an ocean. He'd fought battles and won them. He'd helped defeat the Wehrmacht and liberate camps and push the Reich back into history. But a 5-cent bottle of Coca-Cola had taught him more about the nature of victory than any of that. Because victory wasn't just about who won the battles. It was about who'd had sugar the whole time. The women would go home eventually, most within weeks, released because they were non-combatants, because the Allies didn't have space for 500,000 female auxiliaries, because the paperwork was overwhelming and the urgency was fading. They'd return to bombed-out cities and uncertain futures and the long work of rebuilding lives from rubble. But they'd remember that dark syrup in the glass bottle. The taste of a world where deprivation was the exception, not the rule. In 1945, a group of German women laughed at Coca-Cola. Then they fought for it. Not because they were broken, but because they'd survived everything except abundance. That fizzing dark liquid wasn't just a drink. It was evidence that somewhere in the world, the war had been entirely different. And now they'd have to learn to live in the world that won. If this story gave you a new perspective on the hidden human moments of World War II, hit that like button. Subscribe for more untold stories from history's margins, the small moments that reveal enormous truths. And drop a comment. What other seemingly trivial items from the post-war period revealed the biggest gaps between victors and defeated? I read every response.